how about we get started? Um, Hello, writers. Jacob Jans here with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. How about we get started? Hello, writers. I'm pleased to introduce John Claude Bemis. He'll be giving a talk on how to keep readers glued to the page with microplotting. Not only do these strategies keep people reading, they're also expected to be used in your books. They're expected by most agents and major publishers these days. This lecture is part of our monthly lecture series where we present talks on the craft of writing and the business of publishing. John is a children's book author with books published by Penguin Random House and Disney Hyperion. His books are known to be quite engaging. As one reader said about his book, The Wooden Prince, the captivating storyline and the endearing characters made it difficult to put the book down once it started. So John's going to be sharing with you some strategies about how to do just that. So of course, John is also an instructor for the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. His upcoming course on children's book writing sold out very quickly. The course guides students through the process of writing and publishing a children's book. Plus, John is a thoughtful and generous instructor. As one student wrote, so many invaluable insights into the world of getting published and what it takes. I cannot say enough things about the detailed feedback he gave to my assignments. John really is a generous and thoughtful instructor for us, and I'm really grateful that you're teaching for the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish, John. So without further ado, I want to say thank you, John, for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob. Great to be here and great to be with all of you all around the world. It's a sunny afternoon in North Carolina in the American South, although it is quite cold outside. And we might even get a little snow later this week, believe it or not. Yes, I'm John Claude Bemis, and I'm a writer. Here I am up in my office. I've been working this morning on a novel that I'm currently first draft on. And so a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you today are things that I think about on a daily basis when I'm working on scenes to make them interesting, to make them engaging, and also when I come back to work on revisions. And so I'm hoping that some of the techniques and things that I'm going to be sharing with you here today are going to be things that you'll be able to apply at many stages in the process of creating whatever kind of story you are working on. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we will get things started. Let's jump into it. All right, microplotting, engaging readers on every page. So just to make sure that we understand where we're coming from on what microplotting is. I mean, this is just a term that I came up with, but it's just something that to me, I felt like was a way of thinking about the process, not of plotting the larger story, not how the story is going to go from the opening page to the last page of your book, but just on the smaller level, how we think about individual scenes and giving them their own shape, their own arc, because in a way, each scene, each chapter can almost be like a mini story into itself when done well. I think that with a lot of stories, we often think that the big dramatic moments, that those are going to be the thing that is going to hold your readers captive throughout the novel. But the truth is, you don't have that many of those huge dramatic moments in your story. And much more of our stories are built upon these smaller scenes. And often it's these smaller scenes, if not done well, that will be the exact moments where readers will start to get bored. They'll start to think about that other book in their to be read pile, and you might lose readers in those moments. So let's look at how to make some of those better. And just as quick note, because I am a children's book author, I know not all of you might be Harry Potter fans, but whether you're a Harry Potter fan or not, certainly one of the big questions since these books have come out and become such a worldwide phenomenon has been, why? Why are these books? Why have these books done so well? The truth is, with these books, the Harry Potter books, the idea of a boy wizard who goes off to a school of magic and fights a dark lord is certainly not anything that is new or novel. There have been a bazillion books before Harry Potter that have done what this book has done on that large macro plot level. And I think the truth about why J.K. Rowling has had so much success with these books is because she has really mastered this technique of how to make each chapter, each scene, the smallest moments are quite engaging. I've noticed also how often an individual scene might, no matter how tiny the moment and how insignificant what is happening in that scene is, she has a way of building curiosity about what is going to happen next in the story. And not next as in the following chapter, but often next as in the very next page or the very next paragraph. When we can get in that frame of mind where we're starting to think about how to make those moments that are so small on the paragraph and the page level interesting, then we are going to start to create stories that really will be fun and exciting and engaging and entertaining for our readers throughout. So let's look at some things that I've discovered that I feel like work well with that. Anticipation, I think, is the key. Again, as I said, wondering where is this going? What is going to happen next? Readers will not read readers might have a big question about how's this story going to end, but that is not often going to hold their attention throughout the story. So in each of the smaller scenes, we want to think about making sure that the reader has a sense for where this story is going right now in this particular moment, of having a sense, building a sense of curiosity for how the things are developing in the individual chapter. It's a way of also trying to watch out that your story is not meandering, that we're not overdoing scenes that are going to be relatively static, where there's not much advancing in the story. There might be some beautiful lyrical language, some nice description. There might be a scene or a chapter where you feel like you need to get some exposition across. You need to explain some backstory to your reader. But sometimes that can come across as somewhat flat, that it's just like an info dump, as people sometimes call it, where you just are dropping a bunch of information on the reader, but it's not exactly engaging because there's not that movement of this is going forward. Where is this going? Every page of the story is an opportunity for the reader to care about what is happening. And of course, every page of the story is an opportunity for the reader to say, oh God, who cares? And just throws the story to the side. We want to make sure that that our readers do care and are invested on every single page. So, two things that I think are key. Hang on, just for a second. Let me clarify. When I say, I'm going to often use chapter and scene somewhat interchangeably, and I'm kind of loose on how I'm thinking about these. Sometimes a scene, there might be multiple scenes in a particular chapter, and sometimes a scene might, in fact, stretch across a couple of chapters. So this is kind of a loose definition I'm working with. But when we're thinking about a scene, as I'm talking about it in this sense of microplotting a scene, I'm thinking about a particular section of the story that has its own arc, that seems like it has its own beginning and carries itself to a natural resolution or some sort of ending. So with each scene of our story, there are two things that it should be doing, ideally. It should be advancing the plot, carrying the larger story forward, that there is some sort of forward movement. Or it should be deepening our understanding of the character. So as we explore both of those, I want to start with talking about how our scenes can advance the story and some techniques that we can use in a scene that might be advancing the story by looking at a children's book that I love called The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. And I'm gonna read to you a little bit from the opening of The Graveyard Book. But I'm going to also use this as an opportunity to show you a couple of techniques, a couple of ways of thinking about storytelling that Neil Gaiman is using nicely in this opening that keep readers engaged. And even before I start to read from this opening scene, which will just take a couple of minutes, notice even this is the very first page of the book, and it just has the single line, "There was a hand in the darkness, and it held a knife." Now, even when we just look at that, notice how there is a sense of anticipation. There is the simple statement already is building reader curiosity. And a lot of how we know that we have a sense of anticipation, reader curiosity, is that something that we have presented to the reader generates questions in the reader's head. For example, when we see this simple line, "There was a hand in the darkness and held a knife," some of the questions that are probably coming to mind to you or for most readers are, whose hand is this? Who is this particular person? What are they doing? And the fact that they are holding a knife, we don't yet know what they've done with this knife, but we're suspecting it's probably not slicing a tomato. There is probably something much darker at work here with this knife. And so we want to turn the page. We want to find out what happens next. So let me read to you a little bit more from this scene, and then we're going to break it down just a little bit, looking at a couple of the techniques that Neil Gaiman is using to use a scene that is advancing the story forward in a way that is engaging. "There was a hand in the darkness, and it held a knife. The knife had a handle of polished black bone, and a blade finer and sharper than any razor. If it sliced you, you might not even know you had been cut, not immediately. The knife had done almost everything it was brought to the house to do, and both the blade and the handle were wet. The street door was still open, just a little, where the knife and the man who held it had slipped in, and wisps of nighttime mist slithered and twined into the house through the open door. The man Jack paused on the landing. With his left hand, he pulled a large white handkerchief from the pocket of his black coat, and with it he wiped off the knife and his gloved right hand, which had been holding it. Then he put the handkerchief away. The hunt was almost over. He had left the woman in her bed, the man on the bedroom floor, the older child in her brightly colored bedroom, surrounded by toys and half-finished models. That only left the little one, a baby, barely a toddler, to take care of. One more and his task would be done. He flexed his fingers. The man Jack was above all things a professional, or so he told himself, and he would not allow himself to smile until the job was completed. His hair was dark, and his eyes were dark, and he wore black leather gloves of the thinnest lambskin. The toddler's room was at the very top of the house. The man Jack walked up the stairs, his feet silent on the carpeting. Then he pushed open the attic door and he walked in. His shoes were black leather, and they were polished to such a shine that they looked like dark mirrors. You could see the moon reflected in them, tiny and half full. The real moon shone through the casement window. Its light was not bright, and it was diffused by the mist. But the man Jack would not need much light. The moonlight was enough. It would do. He could make out the shape of the child in the crib, head and limbs and torso. The crib had high slatted sides to prevent the child from getting out. Jack leaned over, raised his right hand, the one holding the knife, and he aimed for the chest. And then he lowered his hand. The shape in the crib was a teddy bear. There was no child. Now, technically that's not the end of the scene, but it could almost operate as the end of the scene. So for the sake of time, I'm going to call that the end of this particular scene. Now, were you on the edge of your seats? wondering, like this, and in particular, were you afraid that, oh my gosh, is this man going to kill a baby? He is, they're obviously, not all of us are writing thrillers. Not all of us are writing stories that have these kind of dark murderers in it. But let's look at some of the techniques that you can still use to apply to whatever kind of story you're writing, because we've all read those kind of stories that know how to take even moments where there's not a life or death situation, and to make it engaging, keeping the reader interested on that micro level. Now, one of the things that Neil Gaiman is doing so well that you could take into play with your writing, regardless of what type of story you're writing, was just that idea of almost looking back. And this is a nice thing to do in revisions, to look back and kind of put yourself in the reader's shoes and think about what questions are they going to have in their minds in each paragraph, or even in each sentence in the story as it goes forward. There was a hand in the darkness and it held a knife. We talked about how that produces those questions of, who is this person? Why do they have a knife? And then the nice thing is we get that question answered almost immediately on the next page. But when we get the answer, it's as if we are already getting presented with new questions. Because on the very next page, we find out that indeed, this is a knife that has been used for murder. Although, nicely done, Neil Gaiman, he never says the word blood. He never says the word murder. He just says that the blade and the handle are wet. Notice how nicely that just creates that, the fact that you and the reader in your mind have to make that little split second connection in your head, that when you hear wet, that we realize what that really means. Anytime the reader, this is just a small aside, but anytime the reader has an opportunity to make a small inference about something, it creates more engagement. The reader is now more actively involved in figuring out what's happening in the story, even though it's relatively easy to figure out from the situation that was supposed to be blood. And then if we wonder if there is blood on the knife, it is wet, who has he killed? There's that next question that we have, and we get the answer to it almost immediately. We find out that, again, he doesn't say that they're dead, but he says that he left the woman in her bed, the man on the bedroom floor. In other words, there's a nice sense of advancing the story on that small level with senses of creating a sense of curiosity or a question in the reader's mind, and then paying that off almost immediately with an answer. Sometimes as writers, we might get, especially in an opening chapter, we might get so caught up in wanting to create so many questions and so many mysteries for our reader that we're not spending enough time giving them the payoff of that setup. Of getting them that small sense of satisfaction, that one thing that has been set up as a source of tension or as a question gets resolved in a nice way. And when it gets layered in these little, small, minute ways, creating the sense of curiosity about the hand in the darkness, whose hand that is, just presenting that way, rather than starting off and saying, the man Jack came into the house with a knife and killed the family. That's just the direct way of doing it. But there's another way of writing it that builds a bit of more curiosity and suspense. The other thing that I think is a nice takeaway from this opening for you to do is to also think about how the heightening of trying to identify what emotions the reader might feel, as well as what hopes and expectations the reader has in this scene. Even though this scene is told from the perspective of the man, Jack, the murderer, we are not on his side. We are not rooting for this guy to kill this baby and to have killed this family. So we, as the reader, are hoping he is not going to be, when we find out that he is in fact looking for a baby, we are hoping that is not what is going to happen. And it creates a sense of terror and dread in us. But the scene that you might be writing might not be a scene with terror or dread. But if you can take a moment to identify what emotion are you hoping is the emotion that not necessarily that your character will have, because that's relatively easy to show what your character's emotion is. But what emotion do you want this scene to produce in your reader and looking for ways to craft and tweak your writing so it brings out that emotion in the reader and it plays with certain expectations the reader has. Back to that idea of anticipation. We are on the edge of our seat with this scene because we are wondering and anticipating whether the baby will get killed. There's that sense of anticipation here. And now the question is, if the baby's not in the crib, then what next? I'll leave it to you. Go get the Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. It's a fun one to read. But let's look at another scene that does not have life or death. Well, it does have a death in it, but because this is a murder investigation. But we're going to look at another scene that's a little lower stakes. And this comes from a mystery book, not a children's fiction. I don't know how many of you have read or are reading the Thursday Murder Club, but it's quite a fun mystery novel. And I want to pull one small scene from this, and we're going to look at it in the sense of that there is not much. If in the Neil Gaiman scene, that was advancing the plot because it was setting up that this family is murdered, that who is it that has, because we never really got a sense for who that character, the man Jack, was, except that he's evil. We have no idea. It's never explained in that part why he's even doing this. That is something that we'll have to find out later. But in that moment, who cares why he's doing it? Because we're engaged in the particular scene. We trust that we will find out that question, the answer to that question later. But there are some scenes that don't necessarily advance the plot all that much, but it's a nice scene for just giving the reader a stronger sense of who the character is. And this is a nice little moment from the Thursday Murder Club. You don't have to know anything about what the Thursday Murder Club is to appreciate this scene, but all I will say is that obviously there has been a murder and there is an active investigation. And the character that we're going to follow in this very short scene is the police commissioner, the PC, Donna de Freitas. I assume that's how you pronounce her last name. So here we go, a little bit from the Thursday Murder Club. And then we're going to break this one down because this is not one of those hanging on the edge of your seat kind of scenes, but it is quite engaging in a different way. And so let's look at what's going on with this particular scene. Okay, so from the Thursday Murder Club. PC Donna de Freitas carried a tray of teas into the incident room. A local builder, Tony something, had been murdered, and judging by the size of the assembled team, it's a big deal. Donna wonders why. If she takes her time with the teas, maybe she can find out. Detective Chief Inspector Chris Hudson is addressing the team. He always seems nice enough. He once opened some double doors for her, without looking like he wanted a medal for it. There are cameras at the property, and plenty of them. Get the footage. Tony Curran left Cooper's Chase at 2, and he died at 2:32, according to his Fitbit. That's only a small window to search. Donna had placed the tea tray on a desk while she stood to tie her shoelaces. She hears Cooper Chase mentioned, which is interesting. There are also cameras on the A214 around 400 meters south of Curran's home and half a mile north. So let's get a hold of the footage too. You know the time frame. Chris stops for a moment and looks over to where Donna de Freitas is crouching. Everything all right, Constable? He asks. Donna straightens up. Yes, sir. Just tying my shoelaces. Wouldn't want to trip with a tray of teas. Very wise, agreed Chris. Thank you for the tea. We'll let you get on now. Thank you, sir, said Donna, walking toward the door. She realizes that Chris, a detective, of course, has probably spotted that her shoelaces have no laces. But surely he wouldn't blame the young constable for a bit of healthy curiosity. As she opens the door, she hears Chris Hudson continue. Until we get all that, the biggest lead is the photograph the killer left by the body. Let's take a look. Donna can't resist turning. And she sees projected onto the wall an old photograph of 3 men in a pub laughing and drinking, their table covered in banknotes. She has only a moment, but she recognizes one of the men immediately. Things would be very different when Donna was part of the murder squad. Very different. No more visiting primary schools. to write serial numbers on bikes in invisible ink. No more politely reminding shopkeepers that overflowing bins were actually a criminal offense. Constable, says Chris, snapping Donna from her train of thought. She takes her eyes off the photo and looks at Chris. Firmly but kindly, he motions that she is free to leave. She smiles at him and nods. Daydreaming, sir. Sorry. She opens the door and walks through, back to the boredom. She strains to hear every last word before the door finally swings shut. So 3 men, all of whom we obviously know very well. Shall we take them one by one? The door clunks shut. Donna sighs. All right. So now this doesn't really advance the plot all that much, except just because the reader already knew that this man had been murdered. They already knew that there was going to be a police investigation. This is just our first actually not our first introduction of Donna, but our first introduction to her realizing a deeper sense of who her character is. We have seen her before, but not in scenes that are from her point of view. Now, the thing that I want you to also notice in this scene is that it is a scene that I consider it a scene because it had its own arc. It began with her physically walking into the room, and it ended with her physically walking out. That creates nice little, bookends, if you will, just to this particular scene. It frames it. It gives it a sense that it is complete. And one of the things that it's doing is it's giving us throughout this scene, we were getting a sense for what Donna wants. I mean, she is bored with her job. She wishes she was on the murder squad. She feels like she's not given enough challenging work here. And in this particular moment, in this particular scene, what she really wants is just to listen a little bit more on the murder investigation. She's curious. She even recognizes one of the people in the picture. So she feels like she has something to contribute. Now, notice that if we go back to that question that I was asking in the previous one about what does the reader want as well, as writers, to try to think a little bit about what am I doing in this particular scene that is creating a want on the part of the reader, a curiosity on their part. In the previous one, obviously, we wanted that baby to live. We didn't want that guy, that man Jack, to come in and murder that baby. But in this scene, it is creating for us as readers a sense that we want Donna to be part of that murder investigation. We want something more for her than just to have her, kind but somewhat dismissive captain, or whoever telling her, okay, you can leave, you can bring us the tea, but now go. So now we're on her side. We have invested in her as a character because of this small 2-page scene. Now, one thing, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more in a moment, but I want to point out a couple of things that I think every scene, a way of identifying some things about whether a scene is working nicely is whether the character has a particular want in that scene. We talked about readers wanting something, but the character needs to want something too. Otherwise, it might become somewhat of a flat scene with a passive character who's just sitting around and other people are doing the heavy lifting of the story, the interesting stuff. Donna wants to be part of this immersion. She wants to find out more. She's curious. She wants to be part of the investigation. That want is established. But when a character wants something, we're writing fiction, we're writing drama. And the thing that makes stories interesting is when characters encounter obstacles. She's faced with small obstacles, even in this scene, the kindly detective, kindly detective who also is telling her, get out, move on. But also the fact that an obstacle for her is just where she sits in the hierarchy of the police force. She's not on the murder squad yet. So what is she going to need to do if she does want to get onto the murder squad to get on there? But the fact that even though in the end, she is not successful. This scene does not end with her coming up with some brilliant observation from the photograph and getting and convincing the murder squad to let her be a part of it. It ultimately ends with her just being dismissed and she walks back out the door. But that creates a little suspense for wondering, will she ever get on here? But still, it ended in a sense, if every scene ends either with success or failure, This was a failure on her part. She didn't get exactly what she wanted, but we're rooting for her. And the fact that she didn't get what she wanted makes us root for her even more. The last thing I want to point out, which is nice, is how little either of these two scenes had in the way of exposition or backstory. There was a little bit in this one. We got a little bit of a sense of some backstory for her and how in her job, she's often just going to schools and writing down, the serial numbers and invisible ink on the bikes. That's the kind of stuff that she winds up having to do in her daily job. That's a bit of backstory. But notice how nicely it was just woven in. It's kind of seamlessly. It didn't distract us from the action, the immediacy and the interest and pace of this particular scene. And Neil Gaiman, on the other hand, with that other scene, he doesn't even give us exposition at all about who the family was. He doesn't tell us their names. The murderer himself is just the man Jack, which that doesn't quite seem like even a real name. Sometimes if we have too much exposition, if we pause the interest and action and excitement of the story too long just to deliver exposition and information to our readers, that's when we lose readers. That's when they start to get bored. That's when they get tempted by that other book. Okay, so let's look at a couple of questions that I think are very helpful ones. All right. And you're gonna see these questions continue in the coming slides. So if you want to hang on to, if you want to jot them down, you're gonna have plenty of time to do so. But again, just to reiterate this point, I would urge you to think of each scene in your story as a mini story, that it needs to have a sense of advancement, of moving forward. It needs to have a flow. And by giving your scene a strong sense of a beginning and a strong sense of an ending is going to give it a dramatic arc that is going to follow. And notice how even, that scene that I just read from the Thursday Murder Club, it wasn't super dramatic, but notice how nicely framed it was with the simple choice of it beginning with her walking in and ending with her walking out. So some of these I've mentioned already, but the 5 questions that I would urge you, these are questions that for some of you as writers, especially those of you who have been writing for a while, this might all be kind of instinctive for you. You might already be doing a lot of this already in how you think about a scene. But I think that these 5 questions can be helpful if you are having a little bit of trouble. If you have a scene where you just feel like you are not quite getting it right, or you don't have a good sense for where you want how the scene to work or to operate, or you're worried that you're writing a boring scene. You're worried that you just have this scene that, oh my gosh, all this is just delivering some exposition. This isn't even really advancing the story or deepening the character in any way. Then these 5 questions might just be some simple questions for you to think through, to think about, to help you. And also, I think that these are some nice questions to ask in the revision process, just to go back and identify if some of this is working in your story in a nice way. All right. So we have the 5 questions being, what does my character want? Why can't they get it? What will they do about it? And then here's a nice little twist. Why doesn't it work? And then how does the scene end? Now, often I am the type of person that as I start a particular scene, I kind of like to know where I want the scene to end, especially in terms of generally, do I want this scene to end with the character getting what they want, or do I want it to be a failure? In other words, having a scene, just knowing that the trajectory of your scene is headed towards either success or failure. If you approach the scene with that mindset, it is going to influence how you write the scene. That you are now writing a scene that is going to have dramatic movement forward rather than a static kind of flat scene that doesn't really do anything and just kind of circles around with some nice description and some dialogue and maybe a little bit of someone washing the dishes and driving a car somewhere, but it's not really doing anything to move the story forward. So let's break some of these down. What does my character want? Sometimes the character wants something in the scene that is simply to reach a location. We often have scenes where characters needs to get from point A to point B. And that can be a lot of times that can be relatively boring. And so, but by just simply starting from the approach of like, yeah, what is, what can I do to make my character want something to that is clear to the reader, that this is kind of the objective. This is a little bit of the curiosity, is that this scene is set up where the character wants to reach a location. And even though it's not all that important, will they reach their location or not, is something that will be kind of held out there, suspended. Does the reader want to get, does the character want to get something? There's that great Kurt Vonnegut quote about every character should want something, even if it's a glass of water. Sometimes it's something small, inconsequential, but sometimes it might be a clue. Sometimes it might be to get a piece of information. It might be money or an object of some sort. A lot of times characters just want an answer to a question. And that's what, in this particular scene, they're either going to get it from a person or they're going to get it from in some other way, but they have a question that they want answered. Or a lot of scenes also are just built on a character wanting to persuade another character. If you had a scene that was something like a character just simply wanting a glass of water. Now, keep in mind, you're not going to be able to ultimately create a whole scene that is probably going to be all that interesting with someone wanting to drink a glass of water alone. There needs to be something else that will make us actually care about whether the character gets the glass of water or not. So we're going to explore that a little bit as we go forward, how to do that. But one of the things that is going to just heighten interest is just to have some sort of obstacle. Why can't they get what they want? It could be, the obstacles could be something tangible, physical, like an actual, that it's a long distance, or there are people trying to guard this or keep someone out. Maybe the obstacle is simply some interpersonal friction. If a character just wants to learn a piece of information, and you decide to write a scene where they just go and they talk to their uncle to ask some question about their father, then if the uncle just tells them the story flat out, then boy, that wasn't very difficult. That happens kind of easily. So to give it a little more interest, there might be a way of just having a little bit of friction at play. Maybe the uncle doesn't want to talk to their niece or nephew, or they don't want to tell anything about the father. So the character now has to work a little bit harder. Maybe also the reason the character is struggling, the obstacle, is simply a psychological barrier, fear, something like that. Or maybe it's self-doubt, or any number of other psychological, emotional barriers that our characters carry inside them. Now, what are they going to do about it? Now, the point with this is that we want our characters to be active in the scene. If you have a scene where you simply want a character to find out about their father from their uncle, if the uncle just shows up one day and just tells them everything, then the character in that scene is passive. They haven't done anything to get that information. And so it's not nearly as satisfying to the reader as a situation where a character is active in trying to get the thing that they want, no matter how small it is. They need to earn whatever it is. If they get the thing that they want, there needs to be a sense on the reader's part that this character has done something to earn it. They have either shown particular cleverness in this situation, or they have shown some sort of bravery, overcoming their own maybe psychological barriers within them, or they have done something that just has a level of kindness or something else that we feel, we as a society, as a people, feel like should be rewarded, almost in a karmic sense. That if a character, in other words, acts in a kind way, it's almost like when we see, in folk tales, sometimes you have the character who is traveling along the road and they see an old person on the side of the road who asks for some food, and other people have been saying no. But when our little folk hero coming along on the road meets the old person and he asks for some food, the character gives it to him and then is rewarded by this old person with maybe a magical object, or by learning a piece of information that kicks off the quest, whatever the little folk tale is. But that same kind of principle of a character earning something through heroic actions or noble or even if our character is not a good character, we can root for villains sometimes and feel like they earn it just by simply being so ruthless or so smart, that we kind of get on their side and feel like they have done something to deserve in a kind of karmic sense, to earn whatever that is advancing the story. The key here, please do not have your characters get some piece of information, earn a clue, advance the story simply because some coincidence, or just purely by good luck. Now, why doesn't this work? Now, the reason I throw this in there, I could almost have left this out, but I kind of like this in as a way of thinking about through a scene, because if we have a character who wants something and then they face some obstacles, and then what do they do about it? They have a solution in mind. It's always more interesting if the first thing they try doesn't work out, or just doesn't work out easily. That there's just a little more of a twist and turn, a little more of a challenge to our character. Our character who, might be trying to break into a bank, and the bank, has this high tech security, and then they come up with a way to, they're active and they come up with some clever way to get in. We often see how those stories, when they actually start to get in there, it doesn't work out quite the way they expected. Yeah. So that challenges our characters more, but it also creates more reader interest in that moment, even in those small ways. So look for a way just to continue to challenge your reader and not help them to reach at least if it's a successful conclusion to the scene. Don't make that too easy. Although if it's a failure on their part, then that we might still admire them for being particularly clever, even if it turns into a failure at the end. Now, the last thing to say, just when looking at how does the scene end? Again, coming back to does it have success or failure? But I just want to toss this out there as another thing to think about too, is approaching the scene from the reader standpoint. A lot of times, we as readers, I don't know how many of you thought in that graveyard book scene by Neil Gaiman that the man Jack was going to actually kill the baby by the end. Maybe some of you did, but for a lot of people, they would have read the jacket flap on the book and have known that little baby grows up to be the main character of the story. So they would have gone into that scene knowing, with a sense of expectation about how that scene was going to end. And even though you might know that how it ends, if it has some twists and turns and plays, that makes it fun. But it's a sense of the reader lands at the end with a sense of satisfaction that kind of conformed to their expectations. They kind of thought that's probably what was going to happen. Most of us in the other one from the Thursday Murder Club did not think that Donna, the police constable, was going to probably get instantly added to the murder squad. If something wild and crazy had happened, then that would have created a sense of surprise on the reader's part, that it subverted their expectations. The vast majority of scenes that we write are honestly going to probably fit. They're going to be satisfying in the sense, even if it's a failure, it's going to kind of satisfy readers and keep them satisfied because it adheres to what they expect. What they were probably kind of guessing was going to happen. And there's a sense of, oh yeah, I like that. But it's nice to have some scenes also that really do subvert the reader's expectations. That this is where you can also throw in a left field kind of thing, where you think the scene is about this, that the reader wants a particular thing, and it feels like the whole scene is built around that. But then something kind of surprising happens at the end that the reader did not expect to be a part of that. So these are both just little things to take into account as you microplot, as you think about your scenes, is what you might do more of to create reader satisfaction or to throw in those occasional surprises. When we approach a particular scene, this is a Rube Goldberg machine. But if I said to you, if I had a ball that I was going to roll into a cup and I roll it in a straight line, You might watch that with some interest because you are curious, will the ball roll into the cup? It is engaging you. But the truth is, it's not super fascinating. I mean, I guess for some people it's fascinating because some people like to watch golf on TV, but I'm not one of those people. So, but for others, what is fun about a particular scene is kind of seeing where the ball lands at the end. But all the other little things that you can play with in the moment, in the scene, that create little twists and turns, create reversals of expectations on the reader's part, that the reader starts the scene thinking, oh yes, this is going to work out great for my hero. But then something terrible, some big obstacle comes up that throws the reader's expectation the other way, where they think, oh no, this is going to end in disaster. Oh no, but here now something happened. We get another reversal and it's looking hopeful for our hero, but then no, in the end, it's a failure. So some of those kind of reversals, the back and forth, the play of reader expectations with what the reader wants and is hoping and is emotionally invested in with a particular scene, is part of what is going to make your scene fun and engaging. So that's a bit. There is so much more I could say about this topic, but I would hope that some of these questions that I'm giving you here today, and just some of these kind of general thoughts and approaches and techniques, will be something that you will find helpful as you are either starting a new scene that you're working on in your writing, or looking at some of the scenes that you feel like maybe aren't working so well and need to be improved. Look at it with the sense of some of what we've done today, and see if that helps you to think about the scene in a different way. And revisions as well. It can be helpful in that process. So, well, my friends, Jacob, do we have some
John, that was wonderful. For those who are able to watch via Zoom right now, you can press the Q&A button and post a question for John that he will then be able to answer. We'll answer as many as we can. We had an amazing number of attendees today, so I'm sorry for those who weren't able to get into the Zoom. John, that was great. I really loved your example of the Neil Gaiman at the beginning. And one of my observations was how, because of the focus on opening up these questions, the little details in the story, like the toys on the floor, became elevated, right? They took on all this other layers of meaning. And I thought that was just very enlightening, and such, we're always told as authors to include details and be specific, but that's a way to really take it to the next level and really elevate it. It looks like we're starting to get a lot of questions, but I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that.
Well, the last thing I'll say about that, Jake, because that opening scene from the Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, I've come to many, many times, and it feels like a masterclass for me. I've learned so much from just that particular. But what you're talking about with description and details, the other thing that I've noticed that he does in that is he has a little part in there that he's describing his clothes, and he has black gloves and a dark suit and shiny. And in a way, they don't feel all that dramatic and interesting and even all that descriptive, but it's the choice of where Neil Gaiman places it. He places that description after the reveal that this guy's about to kill a baby. Mm-hmm. So notice that you have your reader's attention as you're going forward into a part that sometimes is not all that engaging description. And you're right, it makes the description it heightens it. It makes it much more suspenseful and interesting because we're waiting to see what's going to happen.
It kind of hints at what the answer might be to that question of the baby's survival, right?
And the addition of the description in that part acts as a nice filler to withhold to build the suspense. The reader wait a little longer to find out the answer to it.
Yeah, the pacing as well. That's a good point. Well, we have a lot of questions here. We'll answer as many as we can. So Dorothy asks, tips for scenes with lots of exposition on how to keep those scenes fun and exciting. Yeah.
So again, don't have scenes that are built purely on exposition. And I know that a lot of us might in early drafts need to get a lot of information out of our heads, that there's a lot of things that we have dreamed up about the characters and a lot of things that we feel like the reader needs to know. And it's quite common in an early draft for the opening chapter or two to be very exposition heavy. But I think that this is why you often hear people have that advice of, why don't you just cut chapter 1 and start at chapter 2? Well, it's often because chapter 1 is just loaded with a bunch of exposition.
Yeah.
So and if you have done that kind of approach where you have a lot of exposition, I'm guilty of that a lot. I then try to go back and look at what that exposition is and see what is really necessary for the story. If it's not all that necessary for the story, maybe I can just take it out entirely, or maybe I can move it somewhere else later. Mm-hmm. Things are always, if you withhold exposition up front and don't confuse the reader, it can actually create more interest in the way that the Neil Gaiman story, we don't need to know who this man is or this family is for that chapter to be interesting and engaging. Yeah. But the fact that it doesn't get explained and it gets pushed to later just holds that as a point of curiosity. So,
yeah, I mean, that scene starts so narrow, right? Like you don't know anything really, but like it starts with that very clear image without details or exposition, but it's still really engaging.
Right.
And I like what you said about how I think it's okay in your first draft to have exposition because you can always revise it out later.
And a lot of times we just need to get it out of our heads and onto the page. You know, because it's one thing to have it as an abstract thought in your head, but it's another thing that it helps for you to kind of to formalize your thoughts and about the story by putting it on the page. But no reason why you can't then pull it back out.
Rachel Rowlands asks, what microplotting aspects do you believe are most important for the opening chapter?
Yeah, then I would say that it's the opening chapter. The thing that I want to do the most with my reader is to get the reader to care. What can happen in this opening scene that will tug on the reader's hearts? It doesn't have to be a sad scene, but it just needs to engage the reader on an emotional level. We see this often, there's a lot of Pixar movies seem to do that quite nicely. If you think about Up or WALL-E or some of those, they start with these kind of emotionally, this little emotional connection, sometimes even a little bit sad, melancholy. But I think that if the reader doesn't, a bunch of explanation and exposition is not necessarily going to draw readers in with curiosity. In the same way, having an action-packed, we've all seen plenty of movies that can start off with lots of explosions and gunfire and still be super boring. But if we kind of try to think about how can I get my reader to connect emotionally with my character, what can I have my character doing, being active in a scene where they want something, but in a way that helps us as the reader to connect with it and care about and root for that character.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Lane has a question. I don't know how much you think about nonfiction writing, but how about applying these ideas to nonfiction?
Yeah, I haven't done much nonfiction writing in that sense, but I do think, let's see, well, what does the character want? I mean, part of it might simply be maybe even approaching it as, what do you think the reader wants? As they come into this one particular section or scene that you're nonfiction wise, what do you present to them that creates a point of curiosity, that now they want to know something better, that you're going to lead them to this point, but rather than getting there too quickly, maybe delivering some of the other information in a way that also is framed within an overarching point of curiosity that gives it an arc in a way, that narrative arc to a section.
I would also add that a lot of novels actually are nonfiction, but maybe they're just not necessarily sold as nonfiction. So you can use all the storytelling techniques of fiction with nonfiction writing, right? There's nothing
can.
stopping you from doing that.
I know a lot of people who are helping college students prepare for college essays and things like that. There are a lot of instructors and guides who kind of look to these kind of fictional tools to help to frame some of that.
Another question from Sharon. How do you know if you are getting the reader reaction you're hoping for?
You won't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. We write these stories and we put them out there, and and by the time you see the Amazon review or something, it's too late for you to do anything about it. So, this is where beta readers can be very helpful, I think. And a lot of times when I get other people who are the beta readers, meaning the next level of readers, after you have done your own revisions and work on the story and polish it up, once you're ready for some feedback, these are some trusted people who aren't just, your brother-in-law who likes to read, but who people who kind of have a sense for what makes for good storytelling and can give you honest and constructive feedback. One of the things that you can ask them to help identify for you in your story is, where were the parts that were confusing and where were the parts that were boring?
Yeah.
And a lot of times those are the two parts of the story that you're going to lose the reader. So if a particular part is a little bit confusing, that your beta reader said, I was kind of confused in that part, then you might want to go back and look at it a little bit, and just to clarify. But if your reader is saying that things got a little slow, it starts to drag, it gets a little boring, this is where coming to some of this microplotting and looking at a way to give it more interest and curiosity, give that scene a stronger sense of curiosity and anticipation and suspense, will help to stave off some of that boredom that readers might feel.
I hope that's a helpful answer, Sharon. I found it helpful. Here's a question from Joe Harthen. How do cliffhangers fit into this? I try to end every chapter with a cliffhanger, but not sure now that this is the best method.
Oh, no. I mean, there's not a cliffhanger often. A cliffhanger still kind of operates as an ending to a particular, like, you can still have kind of an arc that ends a particular scene with a cliffhanger, but whatever has kind of come before, I would say that, for example, in the old story, like, the person is trying to get away. They were being pursued by someone on horseback, and and just as they reach the cliff, they lose their pursuers and they go over the cliff, for example, and then it ends with them grabbing the tree. In a way, that previous scene has been resolved. They have escaped from the pursuers. We just now ended the situation in a scene that is leading to a next scene that is going to be interesting. So it's still, I think that there can still be a sense of resolution to some sense of something that's been keeping readers curious or keeping them on the edge of the seat, while the cliffhanger starts a new point of interest for what is to come next.
I like it's the launching point to the next scene, but you're still giving some resolution to the scene that just happened.
Right.
Okay. Right. We have a lot of questions, and we're already a little bit over our time, so we'll answer a couple more, and then I'm sorry to everyone else if we can't answer all of your questions today, but we'll do our best. So,
and I do office hours, right, Jacob? Where people could potentially
for those who are who take our courses through Writing Launch, you are always welcome to any of the office hours with all of our instructors. So that's a way to get your questions answered as well. And
those have been a lot. When I do those office hours, it's fun because the students in my class are there, but then we just have some other people that are there too. And it can be very, like, nice and cozy and conversational in those settings of us talking and discussing things.
It's amazing how well meetings can work online now. So here's a question from Sarah. How do I stop a microplot from taking over the main story?
Oh, the small Oh gosh. I mean, I I think that in if the small little things start to take over your story, who cares? You probably still kept the reader engaged. We it's so funny. I'm reading this science fiction book right now that happens to be called a long journey to a small angry planet. And as
Oh
far as
yeah.
the big plot goes, there's almost nothing going on. I mean,
Mhm.
they're just flying across space. So there's not
Yeah.
really a plot, but the story is so interesting just because of each little chapter is just things that are going on the ship. And we've all read some of those kind of stories sometimes that don't necessarily have a big, powerful, overarching plot, but it if you have those like little scenes that are engaging, the reader will just go along for the ride. And in some ways, those stories are even more interesting than the books
Yeah.
that have great, exciting plots across the story, but each individual scene is kind of dull or less engaging. So,
Yeah. I read that book and I found that
oh, did you?
I cared about what the
Yeah.
characters were going through.
Hmm.
And it had lots of like little ways of doing that with each scene just to make sure that you wanted to find out what happened in that scene, and it would launch you to the next one nicely. And I think those are quite, there's a whole series of books and they're all quite successful and very popular.
Well, I'm still starting the first one, but so far
Yeah.
it's been so fun. To,
So this is another question, and sort of one that I had as well, from Jean Bauer. How do you avoid self-pity in a character who is struggling? And like my thought related to this is I've often noticed that stories will set up a character to do something and it's obvious what they should be doing, but then they keep just making really stupid mistakes. And like as a reader, I find that um, gets a little grating sometimes to like watch the characters like do the too obviously wrong thing.
right.
I don't know if that's quite the same question as Gene, but I think it might be.
I think that's a good point that you're bringing up about that because it can get very grating. But the self pity, I mean, a character, it would be better if the reader felt pity for the character
Mhm.
than for the character to feel pity for themselves. I would rather see a character that is pitiable, that has terrible things going on in their life, but is actually trying to do something, that is being the underdog and trying to, even if the way that they are trying to get out of their situation isn't working. um there's something admirable about just seeing them trying, and they're more lovable when they try. But if a character is has terrible things happening to them and all they're doing is just that internal kind of thought, complaining and wishing things were different, that's not being that active character. It's a passive character. So active characters are just always more interesting.
Mhm. Um, the last question, sometimes books just need to have some exposition.
Of course.
Louise asked, how do you handle necessary exposition in historical literary fiction? I don't think that your answer needs to relate specifically to historical fiction,
Yeah.
but your thoughts on like how to actually handle the necessary exposition would be useful.
Of course, and it does vary. I do think that the genre thing does make a difference a little bit because I think often with historical fiction, there are a lot of readers who are there because of the exposition. Like they do enjoy learning a little bit about the history, so they have a higher tolerance for chapters and scenes that might be exposition heavy. A lot of science fiction,
Yeah.
that's true also for a lot of science
Yeah.
fiction and occasionally on fantasy, that there are a large group of the readers of those genres that they're there to enjoy learning about the history of this Mars colony and how it all happened, and so they have a higher tolerance for that kind of thing. But I'll be honest, as much as I love fantasy and science fiction and some of those kind of things, I do not have a very good tolerance for a science fiction book that is too exposition heavy. I prefer, rather than having large chunks of the opening of the story just be info dumps where a bunch of stuff is explained about how this world works, I would rather the writer not explain it, but just show it. Just like they know it in their heads. They've maybe even written out all this exposition and they understand why the world works this way. But they feel a sense that they can be selective about what they actually show or explain to the reader. I almost like not knowing everything about some of these worlds, or even some of the historical aspects. If there are things that create a little bit of curiosity on my part, it only makes me want to invest more in the story. And if it's something historical, it might lead me to go look it up. But there's always the risk that if too much gets explained in the particular scene, that it will risk boring readers in that moment, if it's not nicely woven in and out of the actual action that is happening in the immediate moment. We are often, as readers, more engaged in scenes when it feels like there is something happening right now. It's not something that some narrator is summarizing for us. That whenever that we kind of pull back and we get summary, this is when a lot of exposition, things get explained. It lacks in immediacy. It's not something that we can imagine happening in a cinematic way right now. But if you approach the writing of the scene, and especially approach how you might deliver exposition in a way that you can deliver in a way that if you were making a movie, how would you film this? How would you show it with your production design and in scenes on the screen in a way that the reader will get it without there having to be clunky explanations for it?
We have gone over our allotted time. So John, thank you so much for
my pleasure.
Your time and the many really incredible and valuable ideas. If anybody has questions for me, you can always email support@authorspublish.com. Yeah, and John, do you have any last words?
The last things I would say I've enjoyed this tremendously today, and hopefully, as a lot of people see, I love just kind of nerding out and talking about some of this kind of like craft kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But just to say about the course, I mean, even though my course coming up is full, I'll be teaching more this year. This year. So if you'd like to join me for a class, come on board. But otherwise, if you have something that you want to ask at the office hours, go ahead, or you're welcome to get up with me too, because I have my email is just on my website, and always a pleasure to hear from any of you, my fellow writers. And Jacob, thank you for all you're doing, putting this on. This is great for this whole community of writers around the world to get together. So
yeah, I feel honored to be able to host these. And I encourage everyone also to look up John's books, John Claude Bemis, on Amazon. He has really engaging middle grade books for those of you who know middle grade readers or just like reading middle grade books. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you, John.